So this is an hour-long narrative, and I'll talk a little bit about Chicago before the fire and kind of what leads into the fire. I will talk about the fire itself, including many firsthand accounts, which means I will be doing some different voices for those people. And then I'll talk very little about the reconstruction of Chicago after that. Very, very little about that. One of the things about it is that we have a lot of pictures of Chicago before the fire, a lot of pictures of Chicago after the fire, but none of the fire in progress, at least that we've never found. And there may be a few reasons for that. Either the camera equipment was too difficult to set up at the time, or it may have gotten damaged or not worked in the heat. We don't know. But we have a lot of paintings and drawings and stuff, and some of them I thought were a little more fanciful than others. But now that we see the forest fires on TV and on the news and stuff, it doesn't seem that fanciful at all. Now, the other thing I'll say is I have the question and answer box and the chat box open throughout the show. So if you think of a question, if you want to make sure you remember it by the end of the program, you might want to throw it into the chat then, and then we can always get back to it, and I will do my best to kind of keep an eye on that also. But we'll do all that part at the end, like answering the questions. So with that being said, I would like to welcome you to Chicago. All around, on every side and every direction, the vast machinery of Commonwealth clashed and thundered. From dawn to dark and from dark till dawn. Here, of all of her cities, throbbed the true life, the true power and spirit of America. Novelist Frank Norris. The years during and after the Civil War were very good to Chicago. And leading into 1871, Chicago was a boom town, the fastest growing city in the history of the world and the fourth largest city in America. It was a swampy patch of land, 6 miles long and 3 miles wide. When it was incorporated in 1837, there were 5,000 residents. Now it contained a teeming mass of over 300,000 people, mostly immigrants, all looking to achieve their American dream. Now, the novelist Henry B. Fuller captured the character of the city when he said Chicago was the only great city in the world to which all of its citizens have come for the one common avowed object of making money. It was a city of industry, energy, motion. In 1848, the shipping canal opened, connecting Lake Michigan to the Mississippi. With it, Chicago became the largest grain, pork, and lumber market in the nation. By 1870, more ships docked in Chicago than New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, San Francisco, Charleston, and Mobile combined. But that same year, Chicago had bet its future on another type of transportation, the railroad. By 1857, it was the rail center of America. In 1871, over 100 passenger trains entered or left the city every day. And if you're traveling from the east to get to the west, you couldn't get past Chicago without stopping here first, often overnight. And this is great for the commercial as well as the criminal enterprises in the city. Besides the passenger trains, even more freight trains passed through the city. They brought 16 million bushels of wheat to be stored in the giant grain elevators along the river. Stock cars supplied the Union stockyards with animals, and the 21 meatpacking houses processed the meat. And along with being the largest lumber market, Chicago became the center for the manufacture of wood furniture. Chicago was an important place for the buying, storing, selling, and shipping of goods. Now, it may have been an important place, but it was still a frontier town where tourists, farmers, immigrants, businessmen passed through the city daily. And being a wide open city, it was paradise for the grifters, gamblers, pickpockets, and other criminals that preyed on those temporary visitors. Geographically, the river was divided the city into 3 main parts. The South Division contained the main business district, the most expensive buildings in the city, totaling half the entire property value of the city. And it also contained some of the worst slums and vice districts in the city, including Connolly Patch, described in a newspaper as a collection of the dirtiest, vilest, most rickety, one-sided, leaning forward, propped up, tumble down, sinking fast, low-roofed, miserable shanties. The North Division was home to the city's largest residential district, where a mix of Irish, German, Swedish immigrants built their homes alongside some of Chicago's earliest settlers. Across the T of the river, the West Division, industrial areas dotted the riverbank, surrounded by working class neighborhoods. The residents, mostly poor immigrants, They provided the cheap labor that moved the industry machine. To the awe of their out-of-town guests, Chicagoans proudly showed off the grand buildings that made up the business district. Buildings of sturdy brick, stone, and Athens marble. But Chicago was presenting a false front. The Tribune described many of the buildings that dotted the business district as fire traps, pleasing to the eye, nothing more than shams and shingles built by swindling contractors. Chicago was a city almost entirely made of wood. The brick buildings were often no more than a facade, one brick thick around a wooden frame. And what those Chicago tour guides failed to reveal to their out-of-town guests is that Athens marble was really limestone from Athens, Illinois. Even buildings of more substantial stuff and advertised to be fireproof, like the Tribune building here, almost without exception had wooden floors, wooden window frames, wooden door frames. Buildings were adorned with cheap, flimsy wood cornices decorated to look like stone and poorly secured. In some areas, they fell on pedestrians with alarming regularity. Buildings had long wooden signs, mansard top stories of wood, wooden roofs covered with felt, tar, or shingles. Interspersed with these fine buildings were dozens of wooden houses, stables, saloons. The shops and warehouses were full of aisle upon aisle of wooden shelves and cases, filled with mostly flammable products. There were 55 miles of pine block streets, wood blocks coated in coal tar and set in the streets like paving stones. There were 600 miles of raised wooden sidewalks that bound the city in a highly combustible knot. You need to think of fire as like a living creature. It needs to eat, it needs to breathe. The area under the raised sidewalks, some as high as 5 feet, provided the space to breathe. The leaves, garbage, dried horse dung that collected underneath, well, that was the fuel to eat. Outside the central business district, there were warehouses, manufacturing plants, shack saloons, flop houses, rotting shanties of the poor, almost everything made of wood. The grease and oil slick river was traversed by a dozen wooden bridges filled with wooden ships lined with combustibles. There are 17 5-story tall grain elevators, tall wooden chimneys bursting with flammable grain. There were lumber yards, woodworking factories. Not only the raw materials, wood and varnish, flammable, but more dangerous was their waste, the sawdust and the wood chips, which was ignited by the smallest spark. To run the steam engines that moved the industry machine, there are mountains of coal in their yards. Every home had its own stock of kerosene for lighting, coal and wood for heating and cooking. It might be said with considerable justice that Chicago specialized in the production, handling, and storage of combustible goods. The great Chicago historian Alfred T. Andreas wrote, "Chicago was then built as if to invite its destruction in this manner." In 1870 alone, there were 600 reported fires. The fire department repeatedly asked for a building inspection department to be formed, metal roof requirements for hotels and other large buildings, more fire hydrants, larger water mains, fire bolts with powerful pumps, more firemen. Each and every request is denied by city government that insists that higher taxes and stricter regulations will stifle business. An all too familiar refrain still today. Chicago's 18 square miles would be protected by 185 firemen on call 24 hours a day, and 17 relatively new horse-drawn steam engines. These could pump 600 to 900 gallons a minute on a fire. In addition, there are 23 hose carts, 4 hook and ladders, 2 hose elevators. There is a telegraph network of 172 alarm boxes that spiderweb the city. They were placed on corners or buildings. They were locked to prevent false alarms, the keys given to nearby citizens deemed trustworthy. There is a water pumping station and water tower that supplies a system of hydrants, a steady stream of water from Lake Michigan. They bragged that the entire lake could be pumped into the city if need be. Now, the city's fire defense was bigger and more up to date than most, and it was good, but it was spread much too thin. The department was also lucky. They arrived at the fires quickly and were able to put the fires out, but there was no margin for error. Throughout the summer of 1871, Chicago had experienced the second year of the worst drought anyone could remember. Less than 5 inches of rain had fallen since Independence Day, and none in the 3 weeks prior to the fire. Wells and cisterns dried out. The hot prairie wind sucked the moisture from the wood and turned it to tinder. The trees shed their leaves early and lawns went brown. By October, Chicago was a desiccated husk of a city. That first week of October 1871 was a bad one for fires. October 1st, there are 4 alarms. October 2nd, 5 more. October 3rd, another half dozen. Every day for that first week of October, the fire bell rang from the courthouse for each of the 28 significant fires that erupted in the city. The firemen and equipment were getting worn out. Repairs were needed. Steamers were breaking down. They were short on hose. Their margin for error was getting thinner and thinner. Then at 11 p.m. on Saturday, October 7th, a fire broke out at the Lull and Holmes planing mill. Adjacent to the mill were 2 lumber yards, a few houses, a few saloons, and a box factory. 3 alarms were called. The fire brigades fought that place for 17 hours before extinguishing it. And 20 buildings were destroyed in this 4-block area bordered by Van Buren, Clinton, Adams, and the South Branch of the river. Now, the firefighting strategy is simple at the time. You gather whatever engines are available, surround the area, pour all the water possible on the entire area, whether it's burning or not. The firemen were exhausted to the point of collapse. The technology at the time forced the men to fight close to the fire. Some had suffered burns and could barely see through eyes that were red and swollen from the smoke and the cinders. That morning, more than 2 miles away from the fire, the editor of the Tribune, Horace White, examined large cinders that had settled around his house. Later, in the Tribune, he would write, "For days past, alarm has followed alarm, but the comparatively trifling losses have familiarized us to the pealing of the courthouse bell. And we have forgotten that the absence of rain for 3 weeks had left everything in so dry and inflammable condition that a spark might start a fire which would sweep from end to end of the city." Only a few hours later, the Tribune's warning would become a devastating truth. Sunday night, October 8th, at about 9 p.m., it started in the barn owned by Patrick and Catherine O'Leary. There are 3 buildings on the O'Leary lot at 137 DeKoven Street. The McLaughlin house closest to the street was owned by the O'Learys and rented out for extra income. The O'Leary cottage was behind it. A small barn butted up against the alley. There are 5 animals in the barn, and in the loft, there are 3 tons of freshly delivered hay. Now, there was no way of telling how or why the fire started. The investigation was incomplete, possibly to cover up any perceived shortcomings of the fire department. Testimony by many witnesses contradictory, and the discrepancies never resolved. The investigating commission's final statement was, whether it originated from a spark blown from a chimney on that windy night or set on fire by some human agency, we are unable to determine. So the newspapers were determined to find a scapegoat, Mrs. O'Leary and her cow. The problem is, even then, they knew that Mrs. O'Leary wasn't at fault. The chief fire marshal, Robert Williams, noted at the time, it was evident the fire didn't start like the paper said. They got it wrong as usual. There was no room to milk the cows in the barn. Mrs. O'Leary milked her cows outside, tied to the back fence. There was plenty of dry manure there. Robert Williams was certain that the fire started in this pile of manure, probably by a discarded cigar thrown by someone passing. In fact, a neighbor, John Koch, said he saw a few men smoking and drinking in the alley that night. But once ignited, the hay and the barn went up quickly. Daniel Pegleg Sullivan reportedly gave the first alarm. All normal neighborhood activity stopped by the shouts of fire. Neighbors rushed from their homes with buckets and pots of water. The O'Learys defended their home, repeatedly pouring water over it, smothering the flames with wet blankets. In a bit of twisted fate, their home survived with little damage. Many years later, the Chicago city planners, with an immense capacity for irony, on that very spot built the Chicago Fire Academy. But that night, flames ran along the dry grass and leaves. It ignited the fence in their neighbor's shed. The Dalton family would be the first made homeless by the fire. The buildings were crowded together with little space between. Lots overbuilt. 2, 3, 4 buildings created a domino effect. The strong hot wind gusting from the southwest of 30 miles an hour pushed the fire north and east. Now, a neighbor from across the street, William Lee, ran 3 blocks to Bruno Gold's drugstore to sound the fire alarm. Fire was about 15 minutes old. What followed was a series of fatal errors that set the fire free. When William Lee reaches the drugstore, he demands the key to the alarm box mounted outside the store. Bruno Gull refuses to turn it over, insisting that a fire truck has already passed. Lee has no time to argue. He runs back to his home and sees it's about to catch fire. He and his family will flee to the west with the little possessions they can carry and watch in horror as the fire progresses. In his testimony at the official inquiry, Bruno Gull claimed that after Lee left the store, he triggered not one, but 2 alarms. So why did he wait? Why didn't he just do it while Lee was there? What's even more strange is that neither of those signals was ever received at the central alarm office at the courthouse. In the courthouse cupola, 100 feet in the air, Watchman Matthias Schaefer scanned the city for any sign of fire. Once spotted, he would determine the location. He would then relay that location to the firehouses nearest to it. The giant courthouse bell would also be rung an alarm. When first seeing the smoke from DeKoven Street, Matthias dismissed it as smoldering from the previous night's fire. Several minutes later, about 9:30, he looks back and sees flames leaping wildly into the night sky. He signals down the speaking tube to his assistant to strike the alarm box at 3:42. This is at Canalport and Halstead. This alarm sent the fire brigades rumbling through the streets to a location a mile away from the Leary property. He's going to realize his mistake and orders a closer alarm to be struck. His assistant, William Brown, refuses, feeling the firemen would be confused and would ultimately find the fire anyway. The result of this stubbornness was that the fire companies closest to the fire with their powerful pump engines stayed at their posts. The companies that did respond lost precious minutes in a wild goose chase. One of the first reporters on the scene was a 20-year-old for the Chicago Evening Post, Joseph Chamberlain. I was on the scene in a few minutes. The fire had already advanced a distance about a single square through the framed buildings that covered the ground thickly north of DeKoven Street and east of Jefferson Street. If those miserable alleys can be dignified as being denominated streets. That neighborhood has always been terra incognita to respectable Chicagoans, and during a residence for 3 years in the city, I have never visited it. Now, Chamberlain here shows a disdain for the area that was shared by many people living in the wealthier sections of town. And it's this prejudice that goes a long way to fixing the blame for the destruction of the city on the poor and slovenly people of DeKoven Street, specifically Mrs. O'Leary. She's a member of the dangerous classes. She became an easy target for the anti-Irish, anti-poor prejudices that were very strong at the time. First 2 fire brigades on the scene were America and Little Giant. Besides having numbers, each brigade had a nickname. The hoses were rolled out, attached to hydrants, water turned on. Streams of water were thrown into the flame and evaporated almost as soon as they struck it. The gusty winds quickly pushed the fire out. It traveled north up Jefferson to Taylor Street, east towards Lake Michigan. And there was no way that the 2 companies could contain the blaze on 2 fronts. The firefighters held their position until the fierce heat began to singe the hair on their heads and arms. Their clothes began to smolder. By 10 p.m., the entire block was almost destroyed. 7 additional fire engines began to arrive on their own and tried to surround the fire. It was of little use. The chief fire marshal, Robert Williams, sent fireman John Dorsey to Gold's Drugstore to sound a second alarm. Dorsey pulls down the lever and heads back to the scene of the fire, not realizing that he, too, had made a mistake. He had forgotten to pull down the lever 4 times, which was a special signal that indicated a true second alarm. But unlike Bruno Gull's 2 phantom alarms, this alarm did reach the courthouse. And at the courthouse, Schaefer and Brown assumed it was another signal telling them about the original fire, and they failed to call out more engines. The firemen on the scene continued their battle. While fireman Charles Anderson was dousing the fire with water, a friend of his scavenged a door from one of the homes. Holding it like a shield against the intense heat, they moved in on the blaze, but it only took a minute before the door caught fire. His friend dropped the door. Anderson held his ground until his clothes began to smoke. His leather helmet twisted out of shape on his head. One fireman said, from the beginning of that fatal fire, everything went wrong. Now in the South Division, 12-year-old Claire Innes and her family saw the eerie red glow to their west and dismissed it. There was no reason for them to become alarmed. They were many blocks from the fire. The river would be an impassable barrier that would protect them. Most of the city was unconcerned and just went about their business. The editor of the Tribune, Horace White, summed up that lack of concern. I retired to rest when the great bell struck the alarm. But the fires have been so frequent of late and been so speedily extinguished that I did not deem it worthwhile to get up and look at it, or even count the strokes of the bell to learn where it was. The fire, though, was already out of control. The firemen also hoped that once they reached a broad street or river, it would run out of fuel and burn out. But the intense heat was creating a powerful updraft. These are called convection winds. The fire superheats the air and it rises up. That leaves a low pressure underneath, which creates a vacuum. The cooler air near the ground gets sucked into that area from all directions. This air is turbulent. It will begin to spin, twist, creating tornadoes of fire, sucking up flaming embers, flaming pieces of cloth, burning wood, and hurl them many blocks away. Now, while the wind pushed the fire relentlessly to the north and the east, it pushed it away from the west. And the vigilant work of 3 engine companies, the fire was stopped from spreading south and west. The firemen on the opposite front repeatedly turned to find tongues of flame licking at their backs as windblown cinders blew over their heads. 11 p.m., 2 hours into the fire, to the north, a strong updraft lifted up a 2-foot firebrand and flung it into the steeple of St. Paul's Church, 4 blocks behind the firemen's lines. Hook and ladder was sent to try and save the church. Other brigades leapfrogged ahead to try and cut off the fire's advance. Of course, many of the men from Connolly Patch came over the river to watch the spectacle of the fire. An old Irish woman asked one observer what was burning. He told her it was the church. "Oh," she said cheerfully, "God will put it out." A few minutes later, the roof fell in. And impossibly the worst quirk of fate ever, in the lots adjacent to the church were a shingle mill, a box factory, a furniture company, and of all things, a match factory. In less than 3 hours, 20 blocks crackled and roared as churches, stores, manufacturing plants, homes, shanties, barns, saloons, outhouses, railroad cars, and mills were consumed by the ravening fire. The firemen in its path were driven from corner to corner by an implacable tidal wave of flame. Often they escaped only moments before the last exit closed. By 11:30, sparks, embers, and another flaming mass flew over the river onto the new $80,000 horse stable for the Parmalee Omnibus and Stage Company of Franklin and Jackson. Burning shingle hit an open tar tank at a roofing company. A sheet of fire rushed up and within a minute spread to the adjoining coal shed at the Chicago Gaslight and Coke Company of Franklin and Adams. Now, I've told you about some people that made mistakes during the fire, but I want to tell you about someone who didn't. And that's Thomas Okerley, the night superintendent at the Southside Gas Works. Even before the fire jumped the river, he recognized the danger, transferred the reserve gas from the Southside reserves to the Northside reserves, thus preventing a catastrophic explosion. But the destruction of the Southside Gas Works plunged the South Division into darkness, the streets bathed only by the fire's red glow. Surrounding the gasworks was Connolly Patch. About 12:30, a tenement erupted into flames. The fire gluttonously devoured the slum. Women and children rushed into the streets, screaming in terror, clutching with simple possessions they managed to grab. Many thought it was the end of the world, a cleansing of biblical proportions. Most escaped, the fire being so fast, so unpredictable, and grow so large that a good number could not outrun the moving wall of fire that was now 1,000 feet wide and 300 feet high. Fireman Thomas Byrne. You couldn't see anything over you but fire. No clouds, no stars, nothing else but fire. Even the grease and oil-slicked river began to burn, igniting some of the wooden bridges. Now, when the general alarm rang across the city, which distinguished a great fire from a small one, Horace White finally got out of bed. And what he discovered when he left his home was that the fire was spreading so rapidly it was only about 5 blocks from his house. The dogs of hell were upon the housetops of LaSalle and Wells Street, just south of Adams, bounding from one to another. Billows of fire were rolling over the business palaces of the city and swallowing up their contents. A column of flame would shoot up from a burning building, catch the force of the wind, strike the next one, which in turn would perform the same direful office for its neighbor. Claire Innes woke to a pounding on her door. Her mother yelled that the fire had gotten across the river and was coming towards them. I could hear other voices shouting the same thing, so I went to the window. It was very bright, though not as bright at noontime as some have said. There were people everywhere, some going toward the fire for a better view, others away from it. A cart was stationed in front of the house, and I could see the family, father, mother, children, loading furniture, bags, bundles, and the like. I dressed and went downstairs where my family was waiting. We all took a bundle and left the house, which father bolted as if we were going on a picnic. There was fire to the west, and in places it had gotten behind the house as well, although still at a distance. We were to find Clark Street and take that street to the river and a bridge. The river was quite wide there. Once we were across, we would be safe. Or so we were promised. The sidewalks were jammed with people, some watching the fire, others hurrying to escape, dragging trunks, carrying bundles. The streets were clogged with horse-drawn wagons and daring pedestrians, moving slowly, fighting for space. The frantic shouts of the drivers adding to the confusion and panic. The horses neighed and screamed, maddened by the heat and noise, irritated by the falling sparks. An Iowan that was traveling through Chicago described her family's escape. Our boys ran at full speed and we followed, crossing the State Street Bridge amid a shower of poles. The crowd thickened every moment. Women with babies and bundles, men with kegs of beer, all jostling, scolding, crying, or swearing. I guess men have to have their priorities in a fire. Claire's father was in near panic, repeatedly told the children to stay close together and hurry along. We went 2 or 3 blocks, I don't remember exactly how many, when movement became impossible. Sparks, cinders now began to fall all around us, and I saw the window awning of a house catch fire. Ahead of us, there was much shouting, and then the crowd began to push back on us. Father told us to drop our bundles and hold hands, but I did not drop mine. The crowd moved forward a little. Then people began turning and pushing against us. There was no resisting the crush, and we were swept along. I turned around at some point and saw the window awning of a building burst into flames as if it were built of dry straw. The retreat was now a stampede. Claire was swept along. She felt like a leaf in a great rushing river. The wind swirled and was filled with cinders. She had to hold her hand in front of her eyes to keep from being blinded by the hot ash. Suddenly, a short, tough man grabbed at her bundle. I would not let it go. I called for father and almost lost my bundle, except another man took hold of the first and dragged him away. When I turned, I could not find father or mother or my sisters or brothers. I ran down the sidewalk after them, calling their names, searching everywhere for a familiar face. They were gone into the smoke and dark and falling fire. I stood near the corner, hoping father or mother would return for me. I would have stayed there throughout the night, except the building up the street began to burn, then the roof of another. And the mob came back at me, and I was once again forced to move. At some point, Claire escaped that stream of humanity when she leaped into an alley between 2 shops, and she watched for her family. I looked at every face, but I could not find them. When everyone had gone by, I stood in the middle of the sidewalk and shouted for them. It was no use. Except for a few still observing the fire's approach or dragging their possessions to safety, I was alone in the street. Now, Joseph Chamberlain roamed the streets for hours, finally made his way to Randolph Street and the leading edge of the fire. The flames seemed to pour down the street, gobbling up building after building. The fire was a mountain over our heads. The barrels of oil and heat store exploded with a sound like rattling musketry. The Great North Wall and the Nevada Hotel plunged inward with hardly a sound so great that surrounding din. The Garden City house burned like a box of matches. Towards the east and northeast, we looked upon a surging ocean of flame. Now, even though they knew the fire was completely out of control, much of the fire department was still at work. Engines and men scattered, were operating on their own. They were trying to save anything at all. Robert Williams took an engine to one of the remaining bridge crossings and was hosing it down as long as possible. Building after building was crashing down. The brick may have survived the heat, but the mortar dissolved. The inner structure burned, and the walls came tumbling down. Costing more than twice its original estimated amount, the $1 million courthouse was the Chicago City Hall, the Cook County Courthouse and Jail, the central fire alarm. One written tour book called it the homeliest building of its kind in the country. But for Chicago, it was the center of civic pride, a symbol of prosperity. When its 5.5-ton bell rang, it could be heard from one end of the city to the other. But this grand building, taller than the average, was in constant danger from the fiery winds. More than twice that Sunday night, Matthias Schaefer, along with his relief watchman, Dennis Deneen, joined other men on the roof to stamp out errant fires. Even their clothing caught fire more than once. But they were fighting against a sucker's odds. It was only a matter of time when a flaming piece of debris crashed through one of the couple's windows. Schaefer tried, but the mushrooming flames could not be stifled. He yelled to the men on the roof to run. Then he found that the iron stairway down was already barred by smoke and fire. He was forced to slide down the banister, burning his hands and his face, scorching his whiskers in the descent. About 1:30 that Monday morning, Schaefer started the machinery in the operations room that rang the bell automatically, and then fled down to the basement jail cells to warn them that the building was on fire. They already knew. Smoke was pouring into the jail cells. The prisoners were screaming. The warden was paralyzed. He didn't know what to do. Finally, a police captain by the name of Michael Hickey took charge. He arranged to free the prisoners except for those charged with murder. Him and his men would escort the murderers to the north side lockup and secure them. Within 30 minutes, the bell tower collapsed. The enormous bell, tolling to the last, came crashing down with a roar that was heard a mile away over the bellowing fire. And as early as 1:30 a.m., the fire crossed the river, moving north. An hour later, a half dozen more fires flared up under the storm of red rain. One by one, building by building, block by block, the fire relentlessly surged forward. The main thrust of it toward Chicago's only defense, the water pumping station. Thousands of people surged together, backwards and forwards, in narrow streets, fighting to get free of the fire. Some became trapped and confused. Most stumbled their way to escape through the maze of streets and alleys. But scores of people perished when trapped in dead-end streets. Hundreds more people had no other choice but to wade into the cold waters of Lake Michigan. They would stand for hours, water to their shoulders, their backs to the fire, unable to watch the spectacle, the air almost too hot to breathe. They watched over each other, smothering the sparks as it ignited their hair and their clothing. One woman's hair caught fire. Her husband dunked her under the water to douse it. When she came back up, she begged him to drown her rather than let her be burned up. And in the middle of the smoke and fire and panic was 12-year-old Claire Innes, alone. I ran up the street after the rest. The fire was everywhere, and the crowd split up, everyone taking the route they thought safest. I followed the largest number for a block, but they scattered at every turn and alley until I decided to choose my own direction. Fire and smoke and dust were everywhere, so I ran up the street with the least of it. I was all turned around and more tired than I can ever remember being. I was choking on the smoke and dust and looked for a quiet place to rest. A little along the way, I came to a wide alley and went down to an empty section filled with bricks, boards, barrels, and ladders and such. Now, this is a construction site. And no sooner than she sat down, a man runs past. Then another. A third goes by and yells something to her in German, but she doesn't understand the language. When she looks to where the men had just been, she saw a wall of smoke and fire blocking the way. She was startled by how quickly the fire had appeared. She went to follow the men, but they were already gone. Before her was another wall of smoke and fire, also barring her way. Claire was now sealed, in the alley, trapped, fire coming at her from all sides. She tried to find a possible route of escape. She got within 30 feet of the smoke and was driven back. The heat was like that of an oven. I tried to open the door to a building, but found it bolted. Smoke was escaping under the other doors, so I gave up hope of finding any safety through them. As each of the surrounding buildings succumbed, the rain of burning embers multiplied, growing heavier, more unbearable. Claire retreated, seeking the safest, coolest place, and she found herself back at the construction site. I cannot say I actually decided to hide behind the bricks, since I could not hear myself think in the terrible noise. I did not even look at the fire, but hid my face in the dirt and pulled my bundle over my head. Now, that pile of bricks that Claire hid behind shielded her from the severest heat and most of the flying debris. But she had a great deal of luck on her side also. Most of the buildings that boxed her in did not collapse, never releasing the full wave of heat and fire. Those that did collapse fell far from the young girl. Time would have no meaning in this chaos. She said she lay there for many minutes, but Claire must have hid behind that pile of bricks for an hour before the fire lessened and she dared to peek out. She was shocked at what she saw. Sturdy brick buildings, now smoking skeletons. My legs and arms and back were all burnt where my dress caught fire. I put out the fire and made ready to leave, which was not easy as the openings were blocked with brick and burning wood and smoke. I called out again and again, and at last a voice called back to me through the smoke. He told me to stand away from there as a wall of a building might fall on me. This made me even more alarmed, but I did not want to stay in the alley alone, so I began climbing. The bricks were still hot, very hot, but I found that if I did not stop, my feet were not burned so bad. Claire made it to the street, but no safety was to be found there. She was still surrounded by buildings that were burning and collapsing. The air pierced every so often by explosions of flammable liquids. It only spurred her on the move. She still wanted to find her family in all of this. In the North Division, the story was just beginning. Because of that prejudiced view I mentioned earlier, it was believed that the better class of people would remain calm and law-abiding in the face of an emergency. But Alexander Freer, a visiting New York alderman, witnessed anything but a civilized evacuation. We tried to force our way along the avenue, which was already littered with costly furniture, but it was next to impossible. All the mansions were being emptied with the greatest disorder and the greatest excitement. Nobody endeavored to stay the flames now. A mob of men and women, all screaming and shouting, ran about wildly, crossing each other's paths and intercepting each other as if deranged. I saw a woman kneeling in the streets with a crucifix held up before her, the skirt of her dress burning while she prayed. We barely passed before a runaway truck dashed her to the ground. All the senses were being inundated by a nightmarish cacophony well described as unidentified survivor. Everywhere, dust, smoke, flames, heat, thunder of falling walls, crackle of fire, hissing of water, pantings of engines, shouts, screaming, crying, braying of trumpets, roar of wind, tumult, confusion, uproar. The heat was so intense, at times in excess of 2,500 degrees, it melted iron and steel, turned stone into powder, marble and granite into lime, made trees explode from the boiling of their own sap. Shortly after 3 a.m., a city employee sees a flaming piece of timber sailing on the wind. It narrowly misses the water tower and drops onto the water pumping station's roof, cracking the protective slate tile. Fingers of fire pry through and begin clawing at the wood under roof. Soon the whole roof is gripped in a fist of fire. In less than an hour, the roof will collapse. Once the pumps stopped working, the only water available was the so-called dead water left in the mains and in the water tower. When that was exhausted, the streams from the firemen's hoses dwindled and died. Chicago was now utterly helpless. By 6 a.m. Monday morning, the fire had raged for 9 hours, and there was no end in sight. Finally, Mayor Roswell B. Mason sent urgent telegrams to the surrounding cities and towns. Chicago is in flames. Send your whole department to help us. Aid came from Milwaukee, Cincinnati, Dayton, Louisville, Detroit, Port Huron, Bloomington, Springfield, Janesville, Allegheny, Pittsburgh, and many smaller communities. It would take hours, even days. But some cities sent steamers and ladder wagons. Others sent desperately needed hose and fresh firefighters. And some of these cities did so at great risk to their own city. Our neighbors to the north, Milwaukee, was experiencing the same drought, the same winds, put 3 steamers and their crews on a train, leaving only one working engine to protect their entire city. Now, after narrowly escaping the flames the night before, Joseph Chamberlain went up Madison Street to an area that was untouched by the fire. I had watched the greatest conflagration from the beginning to its end, and although the fire was still blazing all over the city with undiminished luster, I could not look at it. I almost was unable to walk with exhaustion and sought my home for an hour's sleep. As I passed up West Madison Street, I met scores of shop girls on their way downtown as usual, bearing their lunch baskets as if nothing had happened. They saw the fire and the smoke before them, but could not believe that their city, with their means of livelihood, had been swept away during the night. Now, many of those in the North Division escaped by heading west in the open prairie. For others, the call was to go north. Thousands of homeless people turned and rushed towards a 230-acre Lincoln Park, the fire right at their heels. Now, to get to Lincoln Park, many people had to trudge through the former city cemetery. This is the area that's just north of the Chicago History Museum today. In fact, when you visit the Chicago History Museum, you'll see the Couch Mausoleum. That was one grave that wasn't moved. But at the time, the graves were being dug up and relocated to cemeteries further inland because the water table kept them waterlogged and was breeding disease. Many of the wooden grave markers ended up burning as they were piled on the side, waiting to be moved. People were jumping into the empty graves to escape the flames. After the fire, the newspapers would point to Lincoln Park and try to cast the fire as a great leveler among the social classes. They wrote how the McCormicks and the Northside elites were reduced to camping out on the bare ground next to the lowliest vagabond and the meanest harlot. By 11 p.m. Monday night, the fire had burned for 27 hours. 27 hours of panic and running and death. But at 11 p.m. that Monday, something happened that we later called a miracle. Mixed with the smoke and falling embers, people felt the sprinkle of water on their faces. They began shouting to each other with joy. They hugged and danced with abandon. By 3 a.m., that drizzle had turned into a downpour, the skies doing what the firemen could not. See, that great fire would have gorged itself until it ran out of city, and then would have continued unabated its hungry march across a dry prairie if it weren't for that rain. Pockets of fire would burn for days, even months afterwards, mostly in the large piles of coal in the industry yards. But a new drama was just beginning. Nearly 100,000 people were homeless, 1/3 of the city's population. Many, like Claire Innes, were separated from their families and searching for their loved ones. Tuesday morning, the rain woke Claire, who had collapsed from exhaustion. The first thing she did was scrounge up some food, and never saying what she ate or where. But after eating, all she wanted to do was find her house, or what was left of it. Maybe her parents would look for her there. She didn't want to miss them. She knew no other way to find them. She wandered, trying to get her bearings, and was startled by the activity. The streets were crowded with wagons coming and going, while people stood in groups looking at the smoking black heaps that were once houses and stores and saloons. At one place, I saw a woman collecting pots and pans and arranging them on a stove as if she were about to cook a meal. Next, I came upon several men gathered around a charred lump, and each man was shaking his head sadly. I did not want to think about what it might be, so I did not stop. For many days afterward, bodies would be dug from the rubble. The corpses, or what was left of them, were laid out in rows on the floor of a makeshift morgue. 4 or 5 persons at a time were permitted to view them. Only 120 bodies would be recovered, though officials estimated some 300 people perished as a result of the Great Chicago Fire. Now, some of those unaccounted for probably fell in the river and were washed away. Alexander Freer spoke of one such soul. The rail of the bridge was broken away. How many people were pushed over the bridge into the black waters, I cannot tell. I myself saw one man stumble under a load of clothing and disappear. Entire families were believed to have been incinerated, leaving no trace of their life or even their death. The 117 bodies left unclaimed were buried at the Cook County Poor Farm and Insane Asylum at Irving Park in Narragansett, which is now Reed Dunning Memorial Park. Now, after passing the charred corpse, Claire walked disorientated, one block after another, all looking the same, no street signs, no landmarks. Finally, after asking directions several times, she found what she was told was her block. Everything was gone. Where a house had been was nothing but a pile of brick and ash and nothing else. I looked all around, but nothing was the same. I'd hoped my parents would be waiting for me, but no one was there. There was not much I could do except stay and wait all day. Most of Chicago was exhausted, stunned by the immensity of the carnage. But not everyone was paralyzed with shock. Some got right to work as best they could. It said that Margaret O'Toole opened the first business in the burnt-out district, a stand selling chestnuts. As the weeks passed and the debris cooled, enterprising children dug out melted candle holders, blackened plates, fused together pieces of silverware, and sold them to tourists. There was a brisk trade in fire relics as tourists flocked to Chicago to see the carnage. But that Tuesday, Claire Innes sat and waited. Smoke hung in the air and made breathing difficult. Sometimes a great cloud of it would conceal everything and leave her choking. People were all around, but Claire didn't recognize anyone, and no one recognized her. Sometime during that day, the young girl had gotten restless. She could sit no longer and began to wander down the block, but she didn't go very far. She saw a man pacing nervously. As she neared, she recognized his face. It was her father. She'd been waiting in front of the wrong house all along. She learned that her entire family had survived and were staying with a generous family who would open their doors to them. The Chicago Evening Post called it a night of horror never before equaled on the continent. The New York Tribune wrote, since yesterday, Chicago has gained another title to prominence. Unequaled before in enterprise and good fortune, she is now unapproachable in calamity. It was one of the great urban catastrophes of modern times. 2,100 acres swept away. Property worth 190 million destroyed. The fire cut out the heart of the city, a swath 4 miles long and almost a mile wide. Now, in the West Division, where the fire started, 500 structures, mostly homes, were destroyed. In the South Division, some 3,650 buildings destroyed, 1,600 stores and 60 factories. The North Division was the hardest hit. Before the fire, there are 13,800 buildings, mostly homes. After the fire, only 500 will stand. Inside the courthouse, all the public records establishing title to every piece of real estate in Cook County went up in flames. It's only because several abstract companies saved their records that proof of property ownership was able to be established. Lost was the post office, Chamber of Commerce building, train stations, most churches, all newspaper offices, including the fireproof Tribune building. Colonel Wood was Chicago's answer to P.T. Barnum. He had a museum with 100,000 curiosities and the famed Globe Theater. After the theater's destruction, the manager of the theater posted a sign that said, "Standing room only." Gone was the entire collection of the Chicago Historical Society, including an original copy of the Emancipation Proclamation and Lincoln's walking stick. Marshall Field carted off about $600,000 worth of merchandise, while another $2.5 million worth burned. Many of the sturdy bank vaults saved their cash and assets, but not all. Gone were the two Palmer House hotels, the old one and the just completed new one. Gone was a new $800,000 Grand Pacific Hotel that was just awaiting its roof. Only half of the $88 million worth of claims were paid out as insurance companies went bankrupt under the weight of the debt. Most survivors had little more than a story left to their name. And there are many stories about the fire. The one I think of most often is the story of Isaac Arnold. He was one of the city's founders. He was just about to write a biography of Abraham Lincoln. His library housed some 10,000 books, including 10 thick volumes of letters from Lincoln, Grant, McClellan, Sherman, and Seward. When the fire broke out, he sent his family away. He stayed behind with his housing staff, believing that he could save his home. Repeatedly, they pumped water, soaked blankets to smother the flames. But when the water stopped flowing, in trying to save everything, he was unable to save anything. And if you're a Lincoln or a Civil War buff, the idea of losing those 10 thick volumes of letters is devastating. Now, the disaster fell most heavily on the poor. Most of them had no friends or family to lean on, no assets to draw from. And the Aid Society's treatment of the population accentuates the class divide in Chicago. If you were poor, you had to go through sort of an inquisition to prove that you were truly in need. You stood in long food lines. You had to look every night for safe, dry places to sleep, often fighting off wild dogs and rats for space, water, and food. Now, if you're well off, the Aid Society would deliver food to you. The Aid Society had a reasoning for this. They said that poor people were used to hardship and rich people were not. Those who lived through it, there would always be two Chicagos, the one before the fire and the one after it. The entire history of the city would be mythologized, with the fire being its major dividing point and its principal transforming event. Now, Chicago was a proud city, and its boosters predicted greater glory. In fact, the New York World would take up the cry. The wonder of Chicago's original growth will be forgotten in the greater wonder of sudden new creation. But they also understood that many of the fire's victims would not participate in the future glory of the city. Many would not have the energy, drive, or time to regain their old position. The city would be in the hands of a new generation, men such as Marshall Field, Potter Palmer, George Pullman. The first phase of Chicago's Reconstruction lasted 2 years, resulted in the rebuilding of the burnt-out area and the recharging of the economy. The trains still ran to Chicago. The city still had the majority of its shipping capacity. The year after the fire, the stockyards handled twice as many hogs as the year before the fire. And by March of 1872, even after an unusually harsh winter, Chicago had nearly 20 miles of stone and brick buildings, tens of thousands of smaller buildings completed or under construction. But the city immediately after the fire looked a lot like the city before the fire. In the rush to build, the contractors relied on the same practices they always used. Some of the buildings were started before the blueprints were even completed. And the city council was mostly inactive and created few new fire regulations. It would take another fire. In the summer of 1874, one that swept away 812 buildings in an 18-block area on the southern edge of the business district. That's that black area there. This little Chicago fire would cause insurance companies to force the city council to enact meaningful fire regulations. And the city would grow through the never-ending process of renewal called progress, done in a uniquely Chicago style. So the fire happened at the perfect time in history as exciting technological revolutions like the floating foundation, Caisson foundation, steel frame were happening in architecture. And an inventive group of architects like Daniel Burnham, Louis Sullivan, William Jenney, John Root built the city of their dreams, the first skyscrapers, a vertical city. And Chicago would continue this process of a renewed city year after year, a little larger and a few stories taller, a little larger and a few stories taller, a little larger and a few stories taller, until we get the city we have today. As imperfect as it is, the city of my birth, the city I love. And that is the story of the Great Chicago Fire. So again, I'd like to thank everyone for coming. And now, again, if you have any questions, I don't see anything in the chat yet, but you can throw something in the chat or in the question and answer box, and I'll be glad to try and do my best to answer any questions you might have.
Well, I just want to say that was fantastic. Thank you so much, William. Oh,
thank you.
Like we do
I appreciate it. I just have a thank you from Barbara. You're welcome, Barbara. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
So I have a question for you while we're waiting for people to enter their questions.
Sure.
So you were talking a lot about the people who gave statements. So how were those statements collected? Were reporters going out asking people for their firsthand accounts?
It depends. Like the information from Claire Innes was in a letter that she wrote to her family, recounting. But there were many fire books afterwards. So many people. There are many accounts and interviews that are in newspapers also and stuff. So yeah, it's kind of widely disseminated, during that time particularly. So Jane just said, losing all those historical documents, ouch. Yes, I can't imagine what else was lost in the Chicago Historical Society. That really is awful. And again, those letters from Lincoln, Grant, McClellan, Sherman, Seward, all those guys, it's just awful. In the question and answer, we have a question. Was Mrs. O'Leary persecuted by the public thinking her cow started the fire? Yes. Mostly generated by the newspapers. So every year they would revisit it. They would actually get like any old cow, any old crone-looking woman, put them together, take a picture, and say that was Mrs. O'Leary and her cow, even though it had nothing to do with either. And her son, Big Jim O'Leary, was the gambling king for a while in Chicago. He ran the gambling rackets, and he hated reporters because they hounded. She became kind of a recluse, just brokenhearted. And so, yeah, it was just, the press there was just awful at that time. They printed all sorts of lies. The O'Learys had their own business that they ran, and they were quite well off. And she wasn't that old. She was in her 30s. But they, again, made her seem like she was this old crone. And they said, one of them said that, she started the fire on purpose because she stopped getting aid payments, which wasn't true because they never got aid payments. Listen, they were renting out one building. They had a few cows that they were running a dairy business in the neighborhood. They were okay. Did any ancestors write books about the fire? I don't know if any O'Leary ancestors wrote. I don't think so. I know one of the O'Leary ancestors was around for a while when they were doing that little mock trial to exonerate Mrs. O'Leary. And they have contributed to some of the books as far as quotes. Other people at the time wrote books, and now, authors have put the research together because they've found all these different sources and kind of put it together into writing the story. Some books are still a little off. The newer ones are better than the older ones, because the newer ones can get many more sources. And now that the Tribune is digitized, that you could probably get from your library, the historical stuff, in like newspapers.com, digitized thousands and thousands and thousands of pages. We're discovering it's a boon for researchers these days to tell different stories, to trying to find out more about what actually happened in anything. Right now, I am writing a history program that's a kind of a history of Halloween. And so I'm spending a lot of time in the newspapers. I have a couple books too, but spending a lot of time in the newspapers, Tribune, and around the country even, trying to pick out some things that are really important for that program. So I really love kind of doing that research. So someone asked, Meg asked, did most homeless stay or did they move away? So that is also one of the problems with the estimate of deaths, because we don't know whether they just left and had no connections to the city, so you couldn't find them, and they're like, hey, I haven't seen my neighbor since the fire, so maybe they died in the fire, or maybe they left the city, or whatever. We don't know. Some moved away, some stayed. Some new people came to Chicago because William Bross, one of the owners of the Tribune, took the first train to New York to try and drum up money to rebuild. And he would grab reporters and say, listen, write this down. Women, send your men to Chicago. Wives, your husbands, mothers, your sons. Chicago's going to be built bigger, faster, greater than ever before. There's plenty of money to be made in Chicago. So people, flocked here. And there were still, remember, there's still some areas that have some hotels that survived and stuff. So we still had that tourist business and stuff. So Bobby again said it would be interesting to read what ancestors said about the fire and what happened to their families afterwards. Yeah, like I said, yeah, there's a lot of stuff in there. And with so many different fire books you can find, even some of the kids ones, like Jim Murphy wrote a really good one for kids. I kind of took my script and expanded it into a book form that you can get on Amazon, The Essential Great Chicago Fire. There are many books. Robert Crombie did a book. I think Rick Cogan's father did a book on it. So you can find a lot of stuff out there. And Granny Smith, I love your apples, by the way. It's my favorite apple. That's the only apple I really like to eat, is the Granny Smith apple. But is the city of Chicago planning any recognition of this anniversary? Well, sure, because it's 150th. I know October 8th, the museum, the History Museum, is starting a big exhibit on October 8th. And I'm doing 25 libraries with this type of program, another 20 libraries with a pre-recorded program that I have on YouTube. And so, yeah, there's a lot of stuff going on, I think, for the fire. Any other questions? There must have been some hospitals in the area. Any reports of how patients were evacuated? I've not run across any of that in my study, so I couldn't tell you about that. Sorry, I wish I had more information on that for you, but I don't. And I'm not going to try it.
I'm sorry, in relation to that previous question about, is there anything happening? You had mentioned the Palmer House hotels burned up. The current Palmer House that stands today is celebrating the 150th anniversary, according to WGN. I'm just scrolling through my phone here right now, doing a quick Google search, Great Chicago Fire Anniversary.
Yes, because it was one of the little stories about that. I'll do real quick, because I did see that that thing. So one of the architects of what was going to be the new Palmer House Hotel. So the original one was at State and Quincy. The new one was at State and Monroe. And when the fire started, he took the blueprints for the new Palmer House down into the basement. He dug into the clay basement, buried the plans down there. After the fire, they went back. The clay got fired, so they had to break up the clay and pull out the plans, and they were in great condition, perfect condition. And that's how terracotta became the preferred building material for fireproofing.
No way. That's so
Yes,
interesting.
yes. And so then they built the new Palmer House Hotel. So they still mark the anniversary. It's the 150th anniversary of the Palmer House Hotel. And I saw that in the lobby, they're doing slides and stuff projected all over the place and stuff. And they're doing, they invented the brownie there. And so you're getting brownies. And one of my good friends, Dennis Watkins, does a magic show there, which I highly recommend.
Oh, wow. Everyone go to the Palmer House.
Yes. So Jane, most people were probably immigrants. Could there have been some cross-referencing with immigration lists from Ellis Island and stuff? Ellis Island really is kind of later, that kind of stuff. So I don't know how much of that would have been feasible at the time. And thank you. You've told us, you may have told us earlier, but what is your YouTube channel? If you just look for William Pack on YouTube, you will find it. Pretty easy.
There was one question earlier in the chat. I think we missed it. From Carol. She says there must have been some hospitals in the area and reports of patients evacuated. Yeah,
I mentioned that. Yeah, I have no information on that whatsoever. I've not seen anything on there. So I think so. Any more questions or not?
Well, I just have to say that was really great. Thanks so much. Again, this was fantastic. And we are recording it. So if you want to check it out or share it with someone else, we're going to have it up on our YouTube channel for like 2 weeks. So catch it soon, okay? All right, everybody. Thanks so much. If we're ready to go, are you ready to go?
Yep. Thank you very much, folks.
All right. Have a great night. Bye-bye.
Bye.